Thanks so much, Sam. It's a delight to be here with you today. Everybody should have a handout. If you don't have a handout, maybe share with somebody close by. You'd want that. What we're going to do today is talk about the experience of refugees in Geneva in Calvin's day. So to start with, we have to have an understanding of the problem. In other words, why were people traveling outside their own country? Why were they seeking refuge somewhere else? But even before we get to the problem, I'm going to back up a little bit, and on this Reformation Day, we are going to look at some of the words of John Calvin on this very topic. So here are two quotations from Calvin. First, from Calvin's sermons on Deuteronomy. And this is from his sermon on Deuteronomy 10, verses 17 to 20. He preached consecutively through the Bible. This was sermon number 70 on Deuteronomy, preached on September 14th of 1555. Let us abstain from all wrongdealing, extortion, outrage, deceit, and malice towards those that are friendless in respect of the world, and utterly destitute of all assistance, and in a way open to attack, as I have previously said. Let us not oppress them, lest God himself set himself against us and show himself to be their continual shield. So Calvin speaking in favor of protection for the friendless. And then from his sermons on Galatians, which he preached in 1563. We are not to consider what each person is like or what he deserves. We must rise above this and realize that God has placed us in this world to the end that we might be united and joined together. Since he has stamped his image upon us, and since we share a common nature, this ought to inspire us to provide for one another. The one who seeks to be exempt from the care of his neighbor is disfiguring himself and declaring that he no longer wishes to be a man. For whilst we are human beings, we must see our own faces reflected as by a mirror in the faces of the poor and despised, who can go no further and who are trembling under their burdens, even if they are people who are most alien to us. These are very strong words, and they are helpful for us as we continue both thinking about the problem of refugees that refugees faced in the 16th century, but also then the same kinds of issues that we are talking about today as we think about migrants and refugees in the world today. So we're going to focus on the 16th century, but with the awareness of our current day situation as well, front and center. So my aim today is to bring you back with me to the 16th century, to Geneva, to understand what it was like to be in Geneva, both as an incoming refugee and as a Genevan inhabitant who experienced the arrival of so many people. So both sides, the refugee coming in and the Genevans experiencing the arrival of so many people. What was that actually like? So again, first, trying to figure out why did people and how did people flee? So if you look at your handout, you can see that there are a number of dates in the 1550s that sound kind of bad. An edict called the Edict of Blood is probably not a good edict, okay? This was in the Netherlands. This was an edict from the emperor, from the ruler of the Netherlands, Charles V, who put very strong legislation in place to say that you may not house a heretic, you may not preach heretical doctrine, you may not print heretical materials, a very fierce edict, and the penalty for doing these things was death, okay? The next one on your list, the Edict of Chateaubriand from France, kind of the same thing. 1 year later, in France, King Henry II of France put in an edict that said you may not print, disseminate, publish, discuss any ideas having to do with the Reformation. We don't want that. France is Catholic. We are not doing those things. And again, very harsh penalties, confiscation, imprisonment, threat of death. Okay, you can see there's a little pattern going here. And then the third one, the reign of Mary Tudor in England, if you've ever studied any English history, she was the daughter of Henry VIII of England, and she was Catholic. And in her reign, she wanted to bring England back to Catholicism. So, in the Netherlands, in France, in England, all at the same time. There is pressure being put on Protestant populations who will find it very difficult to stay in their home areas because of this persecution. And that has a lot of consequences. At the very end, you have slightly later also the first printing of the Roman Index of Prohibited Books. This is done from the Catholic Church in Rome, and it prohibits a whole raft of Protestant publications. Anything written by Calvin, for instance, is on that list. And life is also then very difficult for Italians who are interested in Reformation ideas, and they end up having to flee as well. So you can see kind of from all quarters, the pressure is building on people who are interested in Protestantism that it's going to be dangerous to stay where they are. They have to find a different place to go. So all of these people decided, no, we're not going to stay. And some of them decided they have to leave. But the question then is, where do we go? At the same time as there's this direct pressure, there are also people who can sort of read the signs. They can tell that even if they're not themselves subject to direct persecution in the moment, life is going to become even more difficult, right? Some people could tell that their opportunities for advancement or for even just basic economic survival were not going to be good under these laws, and they would leave in advance of direct pressure put upon them as well. So I've got an example for you. The royal printer of France was a man called Robert Etienne. He was very famous. He was protected by the King of France, Francis I. He was the royal printer of Francis I. Everything is hunky-dory. But then Robert Etienne developed an interest and a commitment to Protestantism, to the Protestant faith. And in 1547, Francis I, his protector, died. And the next king is Henry II, the same man as the Edict of Chateaubriand. And Etienne could tell that his own situation was going to become very precarious. He had been protected by the old king. The new king comes. It's not going to be the same thing. He is in danger. By 1550, Etienne fled. He left Paris. He took with him a lot of his equipment as a printer. Most famously, he took with him the Greek fonts that had been carved at great expense and paid for by the French king. He took them with him to Geneva. And actually, there was quite a lot of complaints about him having done so. So he moved to Geneva in 1550, taking what he could with him, and then leaving his printing house in Paris in the hands of his brother. And a lot of people did that, right? They'd split the family assets, and they leave something in the homeland in the hands of a relative who is either still Catholic or more willing to pretend to be Catholic to protect that part of the family assets, because they can't always take everything with him. His brother was a man called Charles Etienne, a very fine printer, unfortunately did not have his brother's business sense, and poor Charles died bankrupt in 1564. So the splitting of assets was one way for people to decide that they could make a move in advance of persecution, go somewhere else, be protected, and maybe still preserve some of their patrimony or some of their economic foundations of their family. So you've got some people who are directly facing persecution. You have some people who are making a calculation that they'd better leave before the persecution gets even worse. And then you have some who have an attraction towards a new life. And some of these are feeling that they really want to express their faith openly, and they can't do it at home. And so it's not that they're being persecuted, it's not that even they think they're going to be persecuted, but they can't just express their faith openly, so they decide leaving is a good idea. A good example here is a man called Galeazzo Caracciolo. He's a lovely name, Galeazzo Caracciolo. He was an Italian nobleman from Naples, and he was deeply committed to his Protestant faith. He had been brought up Catholic, but was attracted to Protestantism. He had traveled extensively, spent time in the German lands, and eventually ended up in Geneva in 1551. He wasn't really under threat in Italy, but again, he felt he couldn't live out his Protestant faith in Italy, which was strongly Catholic. Now, there are challenges and significant consequences to all of these moves. In Galeazzo Caracciolo's case, his big issue was that he was married, and his wife stayed in Italy. And together, they had 7 children. So this is getting kind of complicated. His wife remained Catholic. His wife did not want to move to Geneva, so she stayed in Italy, and he was in Geneva. So there are family decisions, right? These decisions have weight, have consequences for family relationships. It's not easy, it's not straightforward. Whether it's a business, whether it's a family, you have to make a lot of decisions before you can make that move. There are some Catholic opponents to Geneva who in fact suggested that Geneva, the Reformation in Geneva was a factor in the breakup of marriages. In other words, they accused the Genevans of encouraging spouses to split from their partners because of their faith. And in particular, the accusation was that Geneva sort of attracted women who, because of their rather weaker minds, couldn't stand up to this and ended up in Geneva leaving their Catholic husbands behind. So it was an accusation, probably a polemical accusation that wasn't very fair, but it definitely tainted Geneva as one of these places that really was morally suspect because it contributed to the breakup of marriages. But there were clearly marriages that did break up. Then the other point I want to make as we think about people who leave is often it's not a permanent departure. See, we think of people from France or from Italy or from anywhere else, and they move to Geneva and they stay there. Well, no, actually not. A lot of them go back and forth. They wait until the persecution dies down, and then they head for home. And if it ramps up again, they move again. So there's a lot of back and forth going on. You shouldn't think of it as a one-and-done move. A lot of these people are actually coming in for protection from persecution as long as the persecution is acute. But if it dies down, they're going to turn around and go home again. So it's a complicated story, right? It's not straightforward in terms of where people end up, how long they stay there, and whether they intend to make their home in that new community or not. That's not entirely clear. But you can imagine that if you're only going to be somewhere temporarily, you behave a little differently than if you're going to be there permanently, right? If you're going to settle somewhere permanently, and you're single, you might look around for a partner in that new community and build your home there and have your kids there and so on. But if you're going to go back, your mindset's a little different. Maybe I'll try and find a partner who's also in exile so we can go back together. It reshapes what decisions you're going to make as you are in that situation, whether you think it's a permanent move or in fact just a temporary one. A group that was particularly known for their exile and return pattern were the English exiles. They had left England under Mary Tudor, right? She's Catholic. Anyone who felt strongly Protestant, if they could, they fled. A number of them ended up in Geneva. But as soon as Mary's reign came to an end with her death, and her half-sister Elizabeth I comes to the throne as a Protestant, all these English exiles, they turn around and we're going back to England. In fact, they raced home to England to be first among those who might get preferential treatment from the Protestant queen as strong Protestant exiles. Among them, and I'll just tell this story briefly, one man who kind of badly miscalculated was John Knox. John Knox, who's known as the Reformer of Scotland, right? But he actually, for quite a while, would quite like to have been the reformer in England. England was a bigger place, more opportunities, better climate, all sorts of things were good. Okay. So he thinks, yeah, England's where I want to be. He was forced out, obviously, when Mary came to the throne. And in frustration at the continued inability to go back to England under Mary Tudor, or even to go to Scotland, where the regent in Scotland was also a Catholic, also named Mary, different person, John Knox wrote a book. He was upset. He wrote this book, and he called it The First Blast of the Trumpet Against the Monstrous Regiment of Women. So he's writing against women rulers, against these women Catholic rulers, right? Against Mary Tudor and against Mary of Guise, who was the regent in Scotland. Unfortunately, he timed his publication really badly. It came out after Mary Tudor died and just as Elizabeth, the Protestant queen, was coming to the throne. she was not happy. She did not like this book. She felt it was an assault against her own reign, and she never allowed John Knox to come back to England ever again. So he's kind of the reformer of Scotland by default. He would have preferred to be in England, but his timing was bad. So you have this pattern where the exiles are often paying as much attention to what's going on in their homeland as they are to what's going on in the new place where they have sought safety. So you have to bring all these factors together to try and understand the complexities of this life. All right. Now we're going to get them to Geneva. So let's figure out Geneva. Here's a lovely picture of Geneva in the 16th century, 1548. Okay. A little town, right? Raise your hand if you've been to Geneva. Raise your hand up to Geneva. Okay. It's still a pretty small place, right? Especially the old town, right? On the hill with the church and everything. And in the 16th century, it's protected by walls. Can you see on the picture all the walls? Okay. They even put barricades in the water to prevent enemies from attacking them, right? Because Geneva was a small Protestant enclave in a wider Catholic territory, the Duchy of Savoy. Okay. Savoy's Catholic. Geneva's a small city within Savoy, and Savoy wants its city back because when Geneva became Protestant, it declared independence, and the Duke of Savoy did not like this, and there's a constant push by Savoy to try and recapture Geneva. So Geneva protects itself by putting walls around the city. Now this is important and significant because in 1531, early in this phase of conflict between Geneva and their Catholic overlord, Geneva made a unilateral decision to remove, to destroy all of the buildings that were outside the city walls, all the suburbs. They just knocked all the buildings down. And there was quite a lot of buildings outside of Geneva's walls. But they did this because they didn't want anyone to be able to use the suburbs to sneak up to the city walls, right? So just knock down all the buildings. Now it's all clear. We have a clear view on anyone who might come to attack us. But everyone who lived in the suburbs now has to move into the city, right? Their houses are gone. They move into the city, 1531. So the city is already kind of crowded. Do you see that? Right? Even before any exiles turn up, the density of population in Geneva is growing simply because they have gotten rid of all their buildings outside the city walls. So, why did people come to Geneva? Well, for many religious exiles, this decision made perfect sense. First of all, if you were French, Geneva was like the best place to go. There were other options, but Geneva was a really good place to go. For one thing, they also understood and spoke French there. They might have spoken a dialect form, but they understood French, they spoke French, and geographically, it's right close to France, right? You can go from southeastern France over to Geneva very, very easily. It made total sense as a destination. But people came from elsewhere as well. People came from Italy to Geneva. The English and Scottish refugees came there. Dutch refugees came there. It became a sort of meeting point for religious exiles. And in fact, you get communities created. Once there are enough people of a given language community, then they gather for worship. Right? They have a pastor that can worship in their own language. That's an attraction. So Geneva becomes this place where refugees are kind of bundling in, coming in together, and almost as soon as you have some, then you have more, because they hear from each other's letters going back and forth, and people start arriving more and more. You should also know that until the end of the 16th century, all of the pastors of Geneva are themselves French religious exiles, right? So that's another point of attraction. That's another reason why people will come into Geneva, because they feel comfortable there. They feel like that's a good possibility in terms of the leadership. So the situation of the city. In 1536, when Calvin first came to the city, the population of Geneva was around 10,000 people. And again, all behind their walls, all nicely tucked in there. Economically, the city was a bit of a backwater at that time. In the 15th century, so the century before, Geneva had been pretty prosperous. There were city fairs and regional fairs that came through. Merchants and artisans had a market that they could sell to beyond Geneva. But the pattern of trade routes shifted, and Geneva was no longer a destination point for these fairs. So the Genevans essentially catered for their own market only, and economically, they were a little bit in the doldrums by the first decades of the 16th century. Unfortunately, they were also in debt. They had quite a lot of public debt because when they declared independence in 1536, they needed military support. And the other Swiss cities sent troops to help protect Geneva, which was great, but they had to pay for it. And that was expensive. Geneva took out a number of large loans from the Swiss city of Basel, and they spent like the next 30 years repaying those loans and the interest on those loans. So, a bit economically shaky with a large public debt and a situation where the city is vulnerable, let's put it that way, to outward attack. So there are limited spaces in the city because of having destroyed the suburbs. There are limited spaces in the city. The population density was high. So 1536, 10,000 people. 1550, so we're now 15 years later, about 12,000 people. Not too bad. We've increased by 2,000, but this is probably still manageable. By 1560, so 10 years after that, 21,400. Okay, we have almost doubled the size of the population in the space of 10 years, okay? This is hard. This is very difficult. This starts to become very challenging in the city. And when I start talking about the tensions later on, I think it's understandable that a lot of the tensions between native Genevans and new arrivals was simply due to population density and the pressure of being on top of each other. There's no way to get away from anybody else, and it's stressful. There is stress in the community because of that. So, well, let's see. We need to fit more people in the same amount of space. How exactly are we going to do this? So what the Genevans do is they build up. They can't build out, so they build up. So buildings that were 2 floors are now 4 floors, right? And you squeeze more people in the same amount of space in the houses that are available. So crowding is a problem. People living on top of each other is a problem. So you can just see the challenges of trying to fit more people in less space. And there's evidence even this was a problem in some of the churches. There's some records from Geneva that suggest that in Saint-Pierre, they ended up having to put more doors in the building because they're worried about population pressures when people are coming in and out of church, right? So we need more space, we need more ways to move traffic around in buildings. So we put in some extra doors so there's actually safety so people can get in and out without anybody getting crushed along the way. So we have a community that is already kind of crowded and only going to become more so. So I want to show you just a few pictures. So here's some of the people I've talked about from left to right. You have Galeazzo Caracciolo, the Italian nobleman, then John Knox, and then Robert Etienne, these 3 guys I've mentioned already. And then here is a picture from Geneva. This is the Auditoire. This is the small building next to the cathedral, next to Saint-Pierre. So if you visited Geneva, you probably went into the cathedral. You might not have noticed the little building next to it. It's called the Auditoire. It's where Calvin taught, right, when he gave his lectures, his theology lectures. It was used as a classroom during the week. But on Sundays, it was used for worship. It was used for worship by the foreign language communities, i.e. by the refugees, right? So the sign says, John Knox, the Scottish Calvinist reformer, was elected pastor of the English colony, of the English community, and bourgeois, Burgess of Geneva, and he preached in this city from 1556 to 1559. So they're honoring him and indicating the presence of these foreign language worshiping communities, not just the English, but also the Italians, and in fact, for a while, Germans had their own worshiping community with their own pastor. So you have these communities trying to figure out how to fit themselves in this space. And then there are questions about how to make this work just administratively, right? How are we going to figure out how to fit everybody in? So what the Genevans did was they kept good records. That's something the Swiss are known for, but hey, the Genevans got there, they were going to keep very good records. And they kept good records because they are aware of the dangers of having people come in that you don't know who they are, right? There's a danger of uncontrolled arrivals, and they don't want that. So they keep a list of incoming inhabitants. They call the Livre des Habitants. Okay, that's the book of the inhabitants. So anyone who comes has to register their name. They have to say who they are and what they're doing there and where they've come from. They keep that list. That's a long list. And then separately, they keep another list, and that's a list of what they call bourgeois. A bourgeois is a burgess. It's someone with voting rights. So if you're an inhabitant, you're just like a resident. You just live there. You have no political rights. If you're a bourgeois, a burgess, you have voting rights. And so the Genevans keep this list, and to get to be a bourgeois, you usually have to pay. There's a fee to become a bourgeois. Okay. And for the city that's kind of financially struggling, that's a great moneymaker. Okay? These foreigners come in, if they have money, they apply, and they become a bourgeois, and money comes into the city coffers. Great, wonderful. For the person who takes on this role, it is in some cases a sense that they want to stay in the city or make their home in the city because they've invested in it. And any children they have that are born in Geneva of burgess parents are citizens and have full voting rights and are eligible, if they're male, to serve in government. So it's somehow, the Livre des Bourgeois is like a smaller subset of the arrivals, and they are the ones who really think they want to make their homes here, right? They're going to invest in it. They're going to make sure that they have a good, strong foundation in this community. So the authorities also put in a number of laws to regulate how they are going to supervise these new arrivals. I'm going to skip over that. I'll come back to the next two slides in a minute. Okay, these are edicts of the Small Council and the Council of 200 on foreigners and how you should deal with them. So 1551. There are several who present requests to be admitted here as inhabitants, and others who are unknown come into the city without presenting themselves and could be suspected of not having come because of the gospel. In other words, we want people to come because of the gospel, because they feel committed, but they might be coming for shady reasons, and we don't want that. Therefore, it was decided that no one should be received without careful examination as to how and why they have come here, both by Monsieur the magistrates and by Mr. Calvin, or one of the other pastors. Okay, well, if you only have a few people coming, that's manageable. But if there's a whole torrent of folks, that's a system that's going to be hard to administer. Also, no one should rent to foreigners without authorization by the magistrates. Also, no innkeepers should rent out space in their house or receive a foreigner as a guest or customer for more than 24 hours without notifying the magistrate and receiving authorization. In 1553, they moved the time limit to a more manageable 3 days. Right? If you've been in a hotel or an inn in Switzerland, they often want a lot of information about you. There's a legacy of this particular practice. And in 1553, the Council of 200 put out an edict on foreigners. All of the weapons of foreigners must be handed in to the neighborhood watch captains, including guns, pikes, halberds, and quarterstaffs, except for their swords, which they must leave in their houses without wearing them in the city at any time, except when coming into or leaving the city. And by 1555, this is amended. Foreign residents can reclaim their weapons so long as they promise to use them for the defense of the city. Okay, so can you tell the tone of anxiety here, right? The government is concerned. There's all these people coming, and we need to figure out how to manage this. So we want to know why you came, where you came from, what you're doing here, and if you come with weapons, you have to check them in. You're not allowed to be running around in weapons in our city at the time. That's not good. Okay, let's see now how this worked in terms of just numbers, because this is where it gets really interesting. Okay, this is from 1549. So, you know, most of these edicts we talked about that were persecuting edicts was 1550, 1551. So this is before that, 1549. I gave you 1 month, June 20th to July 20th, 1549. And here's the list of the people who have arrived. I gave you the ones where there was some information about what their background was, what their profession was, okay? So Isabeau Monon, the woman that I found, that women do not appear often in this list because it's heads of household that register, right? And this is the Livre des Habitants. These are the inhabitants. These are the new arrivals. So Isabeau Monon, she's the widow of a fairly important man, a French royal counselor. Jean Budet, who's a scholar. Karin Maag, who's a merchant. You have a tailor, a needlemaker, a leather worker, a swordsmith, a needlemaker again, another tailor, more leather workers, a bookseller, and a tailor. Looks like if you needed something fixed, you're set. Okay, these Genevans are coming. These are foreigners coming in. They have these skills. A lot of craftsmen, a lot of artisans, okay, but also a merchant, a scholar, a widow of a fairly prominent person, and another 14 people whose profession was not indicated. So 28 people in the space of a month, but that's heads of household. So let's give them each like 3 family members, 4 family members maybe. So let's give them, let's say 4 per household, okay? So 28 by 4, you're now up to 112 people in a month. Okay, maybe that can be managed. 112 people, find them housing, find them somewhere to work, maybe they can start a business. You could maybe see this happening. Now, let's move forward. October 14 and 15, 2 days. Now watch. 43 Englishmen and their families, 4 Spaniards, 40 Italians, and 144 Frenchmen. 231 heads of household in 2 days. Okay, multiply that by 4. Now we're trying to fit in nearly 900 people in 2 days. That is crazy, right? Just imagine how much work and chaos that brings in. And of these ones I gave you professions, I had to organize them, so I put all the cloth makers and weavers and ribbon makers. Ribbon making is a big thing. 29 of them. Shoemakers and leather workers, 10. Students, booksellers, merchants. You can see the list. Okay, there's a long list of people, and 134 people whom we do not know their profession. They didn't indicate it. They just said where they were from. And you could map this, right? You could do a map of where they came from in France and where they came from elsewhere. It's quite fascinating. But can you just see how it has ramped up dramatically, right? How are we going to manage these numbers? That was the big challenge. So the first need was to help people who had fled with nothing or with almost nothing, right? They come and they just have not much with them. So that's a financial need. People who have fled because of direct persecution and they cannot bring much with them. Maybe they've had to leave a lot behind, and they are coming in pretty desperate situations. So the first thing you need to do is find some way to help them find that money. The first port of call for assistance, and the Genevans did this and did this well, was that each community of refugees was organized into having its own charitable fund. So there was the Bourse Française. That is the fund for French refugees. There's a Bourse Italienne for the Italian ones. There's a Bourse Anglaise for the English ones, right? So you organize your charity by group of immigrants, by group of refugees. And you actually then charge them with assessing the needs in their own community. And you can see how that makes sense, right? Because new arrivals would almost automatically turn to people of their own language group. And there might be more awareness within that language group of the real needs. There's not the language barrier, right? If you're trying to understand what does this English person need, and I don't speak English, unless we can converse in Latin, it could be a little challenging to find a common language, right? So it made sense to organize it that way. So the Bourse Française was already set up in 1550, and it's the one for whom we have the most information. And we actually have a number of its records have survived. And so it provided cash gifts for people who are just like, I need money to live kind of people. And it also then provided assistance for people to set up their trade or to make some money through crafts or some other way of making a living. They also would pay out money to help people travel elsewhere, which actually is not a bad strategy, right? If your own community does not have space for everyone, being able to get them oriented towards somewhere else that might have more help for them in a good way, that could be a reasonable solution. Let me show you an example of what those aids looked like. Okay, this is the expenses of the Bourse Française for 2 months in 1559. You'll see a name repeated all the time here, Monsieur de Normandie. Monsieur de Normandie, Laurent de Normandie, he was a fellow citizen of Noyon, Calvin's hometown. He was a merchant, he was a bookseller, he was a mover and shaker economically. He had a fair number of personal resources, and he was like the linchpin of the Bourse Française in this period. Everybody came to him, everyone came to his house. If you didn't know what else to do, go and see Laurent de Normandie, he will help you out. So the Bourse Française, the French fund, repaid him. He would pay money out and then get reimbursed. It was like a constant in and out of funds. So he repaid money to Normandie for money advanced to a pastor sent to France. Then the fund pays for the rent of a house for the widows of some of the ministers, the wives of some of the ministers. Let's not make them widows yet. Wives of some of the ministers sent to France. More repayments, more money for wives of pastors who are absent. Poor people get money. People who have escaped get money. To a poor German recommended by Monsieur de Bèze, that's Theodore Beza, Calvin's later successor, okay, to return to his home country. To a good man of this church by the communication of the council of Monsieur Calvin, right? So they're talking to each other. There's like messages going around to see what help can be given from where. I like the next one. To Julienne for the fashioning of the clothes she has made. Okay, this is a woman who has come without many resources, but rather than just giving her money, they're saying, okay, here's some cloth, and you have your needle, and you start making clothes, and then we'll pay you for those. And she's learning her skills or developing her skills and contributing something instead of just getting the money all the time. Money to a minister, money to a glassmaker, another guy making clothes, and to a boy who's being sent back actually to France. And this is just 2 months' worth, and the pages just go on and on and on and on of the assistance that was provided. At times, these funds would help youngsters, especially youngsters who were either complete orphans or whose parents were not able to support them, and the fund would provide money for them to have an apprenticeship or a dowry for a girl who was going to get married. So they provide that basic starting point in adult life for these youngsters who might not have that. Now, where did the money come from? That's an interesting question. Most of it came from donations from wealthier refugees, or also from legacies. People were encouraged to give money in their wills, right? Remember in your will the French fund. And people did so, and they leave legacies. And that money is then brought into the French fund and used for charitable purposes. Finally, the other money that the French fund has is they work with the printers of Geneva. And for both the Psalters and the printings of Calvin's sermons, the profits of those sales, of the Psalters and the Bibles and the sermons of Calvin go into the French fund. So they're working up like a business deal with the printers. They advance money to the printers produce the Psalters, and then in return, when those are sold, the profit goes back to the French fund. So they think, just like immediate, what do we need to do, but also longer term. How are we going to make this a financially viable charitable system? And they have some really good ideas. Now, another few important things to say. Not all of the people who arrive are impoverished, right? Some of them come with quite a lot of assets. Someone who comes in as a goldsmith is generally quite well off. That is a high-tech, high-level profession. These are not people who are poor. They have very good skills. They will do well. Printers, booksellers, the same deal. So many of these who come can actually start up their businesses once again and do quite well. And in many ways, they actually contribute significantly to Geneva's new prosperity because they bring in new trades, right? All these ribbon makers. There were no ribbon makers in Geneva before. I didn't really think ribbon making was so significant, but apparently it was. Ribbon making and trimming of outfits was a talent that many of these refugees had. They brought it to Geneva. They taught other people how to do it. And hey, we're off and running. This is great. Now we can help Geneva learn these new skills. Producing silk. Silk is a very high-value fabric. Some of these new arrivals, these refugees, were trained in the manufacture of silk cloth, in how to turn it into proper clothes, and they bring those skills with them. So this is an advantage to Geneva. A dramatic improvement and development of Geneva's printing industry comes from these refugees, right? These refugees are printers, booksellers. They have the skills, they have the know-how. If you look at Genevan printing in like the 1530s and 1540s, it's pretty basic. It's pretty crude, shall we say. And then you get the 1550s, 1560s, and they produce gorgeous, gorgeous books. Robert Etienne, but others as well. And they come in with the know-how, they come in with the contacts, and they just, boy, that industry is off and running. And it does great things for Geneva. It's what builds Geneva's reputation. So the Genevan authorities are often aware of this. They're often aware of the benefits that some of these refugees contribute to their community. And you often see these appreciations in the Livre des Bourgeois, the Burgesses book, where you could pay to get your voting rights. But sometimes the city would give it to you for free. If you had done something for the city, or if they thought you might do something for the city, they might give you that for free. So here's some examples. In April 24th of 1548, Jean Béguin, this I'm quoting, Jean Béguin, son of the late Jean of Orléans, a cloth-maker, admitted as a burgess for free because he has set up a cloth-making business in the city through which several poor people are earning a living, right? We want this guy. He's setting up a business. This is great. We need him. This is wonderful. Another one, this is for future calculation, April 28, 1559, Pierre Godary from the Lorraine region of northern France was admitted as a burgess because, quote, he is an ingenious man when it comes to fortifications, and he has come here for the word of God. Admitted for free, given the significant assistance he can provide to the city. He hadn't done anything yet, but the guy knows about building. He is essentially an engineer. We want this guy. We're going to allow him to be a citizen, to have voting rights in the city. We're going to admit him to that higher category, and we'll do it for free. Unfortunately, in that case, it didn't prove to be too successful. Godary died in Geneva later that year and did not do any kind of assistance, but that's just the way it goes. If you were a pastor, if you were a physician, if you were an apothecary, which is an old word for a pharmacist, the city would often admit you for free as a burgess. If you were a teacher, if you were a professor, those ones all tended to be admitted for free. And here's the example of John Knox again. John Knox, son of William, born in Headington in Scotland, serving as an English pastor in the city, and Nathaniel, his son, admitted for free due to his ministry of the Word of God. Right, so Knox comes in and automatically is made a burgess of Geneva. All right, this is all the good things. This is all what worked well. Now we're going to turn to the points of tension. So now we're looking at the situation kind of from the other side. Not so much the refugees coming in as the Genevans with all this population flying in through their gates. So, the first problem is complaints. Complaints made against refugees, and we find these in the registers of the company in the registers of the Genevan consistory, because these complaints often led to actions, and these actions perturbed the public peace, and people were brought before the consistory to explain themselves for what they said or what they did and what caused the trouble. One main area of complaint was economic. Genevans complaining that the arrival of the refugees was causing them economic hardship. So here's some examples. The refugees were accused of making prices rise and making it more difficult for native Genevans to earn their living. So, examples. In October 1551, a woman called Pernette Berthet complained publicly when she was at the city's oven. They have a public oven to bake your bread. Okay, she complains at the city's oven that the French were bringing high prices to the city. And she's asked to explain herself for having said this, because it's an accusation against the refugees. In the same vein, Jean Vinaigrier complained in May of 1552 that, quote, ever since the French were in the city, everything is so expensive and I can no longer earn a living. Okay, he was pretty clear. Things had gone downhill, not uphill. He didn't see improvement. He saw downgrading. Now, these Genevans, in some ways, had a point. And you can understand that, right? Just basic economics. If you have a fairly fixed supply of goods and you bring in more people, well, the cost of things is going to go up because more people are chasing the same amount of things. And those who are selling bread or meat or cheese or whatever, they can hike their prices because they have more customers who want it. If you don't want it at the low price, no problem. I can charge more and someone will want it. So you can see how that might stress people out, just the cost of things going up. And then some people found that the new arrivals had more skills and they had better products. And here they are in their Genevan way of doing things, and now their things don't sell, and the new stuff is selling, and they're very frustrated. And you can understand where this frustration came from. So, two challenges: rising competition that affected people's bottom line, and rising prices that affected the goods that every Genevan wanted to purchase. So that's one raft of complaints, is economic. Complaints number two, I just put in as essentially a dislike of foreigners. I mean, there are Genevans who just don't like the fact that there are more and more people in the town whom they don't know, they didn't grow up with, and they don't have any common bond with as far as they're concerned. I mean, yeah, okay, they're fellow religious people, but hey, we don't know them. And because we don't know them, we don't like them. And we're upset about this. And again, I think part of this tension is simply due to the pressure of population density. People are on top of each other, and clashes happen really, really easily. Here's some good examples for you. In April of 1553, Antoine du Tertre was summoned before the consistory. And this case is really interesting because there are also tensions between earlier arriving refugees and later arriving refugees. They don't always get on even within that framework of refugee. You have to sometimes take that apart. Okay, Antoine du Tertre, summoned before the consistory because she had been complaining about the rising number of foreigners in Geneva. She asked, why are so many coming? And she claimed that these refugees were a scourge. Okay, not a happy lady. The consistory was rather confused about her attitude because they pointed out she herself was a foreigner. But she and her husband had come earlier, right? This was 1553. Her husband and she had come at least 10 years earlier. Okay, so they're the earlier arrivals, and they don't like the later arrivals. They don't feel they have a lot of common with them. They just feel this is a different group, and I was doing well, and now these new people are making my life more difficult, and I don't like it. Okay. Another example, July 1554, André Philippe was accused by several neighbors of general slander against the French refugees. When his neighbors remonstrated with another Genevan who was cursing the French, there's a lot of cursing going on, we're going to come back to that, the neighbors said, wait a minute, the French have made Geneva. That's an interesting statement. The French have made Geneva. So what this group was saying was, wait, there's all these good things that they've done. They've got printing, and they've got silk making, and all this wonderful stuff. The French have made Geneva. Philippe did not see this. He said, by the blood, there are too many Frenchmen. There were not so many of them when my father was alive. In the good old days, it wasn't like this, and I don't like it. Philippe also reportedly claimed that many of the French who were in Geneva were in fact bankrupt. So he was not convinced about any advantage financially that these new arrivals, and he really considered them a burden. He didn't think that that was good. Another common accusation made against the refugees, and this is a really interesting one that needs to be unpacked, a common accusation made against the refugees was that the very fact that they had to flee their homeland suggested that there was something wrong with them. Okay, so this is from the vantage point of people who didn't have to leave. Right? I'm in my home, I've never had to leave, everything is good. You come saying that you got pushed out. Well, I'm not convinced about this. I think there's something shady about you. No one normally has to leave. I've never had to leave. Why do you have to leave? I don't get it. I don't want you here. This is a problem. The Genevans, in that case, equated exile with some kind of wrongdoing. There's something fishy going on in your background that forced you out, and I'm not convinced by your argumentation. In June of 1550, 2 Genevan women were summoned before the consistory for having tormented a French refugee woman to the point of tears, they made her cry, by accusing her in public of being nothing but a deported person who had fled her punishment. So as far as they're concerned, she did something wrong in France, and that's why she had to leave, and she doesn't belong here. They also told her, quote, go on, go back home to the devil to whom you all belong. Okay, the poor lady was having a terrible day, and these Genevans did not make her welcome. Okay, they did not want her there. They thought there was something wrong about her and she should go home. This accusation against refugees that they had fled for nefarious reasons was actually repeated several times that same year by other Genevans. The implication was for Genevans that if you were forced from your homeland, there's something dishonorable in your past. There's a reason why you were kicked out, and it wasn't a good reason. Not surprisingly, in these instances, Genevans who were caught up in quarrels with refugees often suggested that what the refugees should do is simply turn around, leave Geneva, and go home. Just get out of here. In March of 1550, following a quarrel with the French-born pastors over a baptism and the name given to a child at baptism, the Genevan Louis Bondière exclaimed that there were too many foreigners in Geneva and said, quote, "May the devil take these foreigners elsewhere." Okay, we just don't want them here. And so the Genevans also then liked some of the regulations that the city councils put in place, and felt that those regulations were good regulations, especially if they kind of made life more difficult for the refugees. And two men actually in 1553 were investigated by the consistory, two Genevan men. They had turned themselves into vigilantes, these two guys, and they were accosting refugees in the city and trying to take their weapons away from them and saying, well, the city council says you can't have weapons, and trying to grab people's weapons away from them. So the consistory did not think that was how things were supposed to happen, but these two Genevans felt that it was perfectly within their rights to enforce the magistrate's rules and to disarm any refugee that they happened to find. So here we find Genevans are aware of the change of the makeup in their city. How could they not be aware of it, right? It's changing with these new arrivals, and they don't like it. So the accelerated pace of new arrivals in the 1550s probably had a lot to do with this articulated unhappiness with the arrivals of refugees in the city. And then the last area of concern, and this is a really interesting one too, has to do with concerns over the refugees' fervent faith. Now you would think that faith would be the thing they would all agree on. They would all like, woohoo, we're all reformed together, hooray. Not so much. And the problem is this. The refugees who were coming into Geneva had left their homelands for reasons of their faith. They are very ardent believers. They're very fervent believers. And therefore, they come in with this mindset that, okay, we couldn't be Reformed, we couldn't be Protestant in France or in England or somewhere else, and now we're in Geneva, and now we can, and everyone around us is going to live the same kind of holy, fervent, committed life that we are. And then they meet a lot of Genevans who seem really relaxed about their faith, and the French refugees especially do not get it, do not like it, and they clash. The Genevans had edicts and ordinances that lay out strict rules about certain behaviors, and one particular one was about swearing or taking the name of God in vain in public. You were not to do this, okay? That's a sign of problems in your faith, okay? Do not swear, do not take the name of God in vain in public in the city. If you did so, you were supposed to kneel and kiss the ground as a sign of your repentance. All right, so now we have all these really devout refugees arriving, and when we have some Genevans who did not see this quite in the same light. So these situations kept happening. The refugees take the edicts to heart and tend to remind people around them when they break the edicts, when they break the rules. So every time someone took the name of God in vain, a refugee would be popping up and saying, you shouldn't do that. Okay, can you imagine the level of stress in the town when this happened, time and time again? Not surprisingly, Genevans who cursed because of a momentary injury or upset were even more aggrieved when they saw people who they perceived as foreigners taking it upon themselves to remonstrate with them. It does not go well. All right, these moments are often the flashpoint for insults and even more curses and even sometimes fistfights, this time directed against the interfering refugees. So problem one is the cursing, problem two is the reprimand, and problem three is the outcome of increasing chaos. And let's just see how this would happen. In May of 1552, the Genevan bricklayer, Jean-Jacques Bonivard, was accused of having cursed God in public. The witnesses to this cursing were 4 French refugees who had remonstrated with Bonivard over his blasphemy. In response, Bonivard promptly swore at them, saying, "It's not up to you damned Frenchmen to tell me off." And the word I use, damned, is not the word they use. They use something even more blunt, which I'm not going to do. In November of 1553, a local cart driver named Rollet got upset when crossing one of Geneva's bridges. Maybe he was caught in heavy traffic. We've all been in that, okay? So he cursed and gave himself to the devil. 2 Frenchmen heard him and said, quote, "Don't give yourself to the devil. Call on God and he will help you." Okay, it's really nice. It's really pious, but it's a really bad idea. Not the most helpful of responses. Rollet got even more upset, not surprisingly. Rollet replied, "Get lost, you evil deportee. You have come here for the devil's gospel." So he does not take warmly to this kind of being told what to do instead. So these encounters rarely end well. In some cases, punches are thrown. And at least in one case, in 1551, a severe quarrel breaks out between Genevans and French refugees. There's an exchange of insults. One French refugee named Jacques Hérault was chased through the town, sought refuge in his shop, and in the ensuing fight, one of the servants of another Frenchman was stabbed to death, and 4 other refugees, including Hérault, were injured. Okay. Now, we have to be clear, the refugees are not blameless in all this, right? Their rigid adherence to what they saw as truly reformed practices and their willingness to admonish their Genevan neighbors or to adopt an attitude of moral superiority led and contributed to a worsening climate in the city. So there's fault on both sides, right? But just trying to show you this situation helps you understand what's going on here. So, what can we learn from all this? And we will have a question time in just a few minutes. What can we learn from all this? Does the evidence from 16th century Geneva help us think through some of the challenges of today when it comes to migrants and refugees, including in this very country? Well, you can't really take a historical example and apply it willy-nilly, 5 centuries later. That generally doesn't work too well. But clearly, we can learn something from the Genevans' approach to trying to care for a very large number of people coming into their community in a very quick way. They set up charitable funds, and they set these up run by the refugees themselves, right? So they empowered the refugees. Rather than making the refugees the recipients, they also made them the managers of charitable giving, charitable receiving. And in doing so, they enabled the communities themselves to take responsibility for the needs that they faced. There was more of a helping hand alongside rather than a just throwing money at the problem from the outside. The Genevans also figured out who was best placed to help with the needs that were there. They identified community leaders, pastors, teachers, businessmen, people who had the know-how, the knowledge, and the connections to make things better for that particular community. And they worked alongside these community leaders to make the situation better for the arriving refugees. They provided practical assistance, not just a handout, but also training, maybe startup funds for businesses, assistance to get people beyond the immediate need into something where they themselves could then build their lives and contribute effectively to the community. They encouraged charitable contributions from well-off members, and there's quite a lot. I mean, the lawyers in Geneva who made wills were told, every time you prepare a will, remind people of the funds, okay? This was almost like, not quite compulsory, but definitely strongly encouraged, okay? This pattern of giving was a community-wide commitment. Right? We are not going to be just for ourselves. We are going to be to help also those who are coming in. That's part of what we do. They also worked to try and find ways later on, outside of the 16th century, more in the 17th century, Geneva found ways to identify other places who could take in refugees, so that Geneva would become a receiving hub, yes, but not necessarily a place where everybody would stay. Right? And they make agreements. Okay, they don't just put people in buses and send them places, okay? They actually make agreements with new communities to say, here is what we have as options in the city, and what do you have on your end? What do you need? What workers do you need? What spaces do you have? What homes do you have? And then made arrangements to essentially move people on safely to the next point of refuge where they could settle in and find safety when they needed that. At the same time, I think it's fair to say that Geneva needed to do more. It needed to do more to help the local community come to terms with the arriving refugees. That's probably where things worked least well. Geneva, apart from Calvin preaching and the other pastors preaching, they didn't really have a way of helping the Genevans understand better how the arrivals might actually be beneficial, or how situations might be able to be solved so that people could live alongside each other. And maybe even the refugees needed more training in being a little more flexible when they arrived in terms of how to deal with the local Genevan population. Because sometimes I think people were talking past each other in terms of commitment to the faith versus this is just a one-time deal. It's not as big a deal as you're making it. I think I want to return now to Calvin's words because I think they're the most helpful ones as we think about these problems. Solutions are hard to come by, right? These are complicated problems, complicated in the 16th century, complicated today. But what is foundational, and what Calvin recognized, especially in his sermon in Galatians, was the need of everyone to recognize the humanity, the image of God in everybody that they met, and that included the incoming refugees who came as vulnerable people. For while we are human beings, we must see our own faces reflected as in a mirror in the faces of the poor and despised, who can go no further and are trembling under their burdens, even if they are people who are most alien to us. Thank you. So at this point, we will have a time for questions. So if anyone has things they want to ask, Sam has a microphone. I think there might be one here in the front.
A couple of questions. One was, why didn't they expand the city by putting the boundaries larger rather than always considering building up?
The problem is that the walls are expensive to put up in the first place. These are fortifications. These aren't just like little tiny walls. They're big things. And they were hugely expensive to put up. So there's not an ability physically to change the layout. And the worry about like putting buildings outside the walls is that then those people are vulnerable to attack. So they don't really have a good solution. They are bounded by the lake at one end. They've got rivers that make boundaries too, and then everything else is behind the walls, and you can't really move the walls, and building outside the walls is risky.
Okay, what? You had, I think, over 100 people that, unknown occupations, basically.
Yeah, and that's an interesting question. So I don't know where the problem was. Was it that the people did not say what their background was, which seems odd because everyone else was recording that they were a shoemaker or something like that? Was it that there are so many people that the person taking down the notes is just like, I'm going to get your name, I'm going to get where you're from, and next, you know, you have 100 people standing there all lined up. You don't have the time to have the conversation, say, oh, and what do you do for a living? You know, you just want to get the basics down. And the spellings are wonderful, too. I mean, you know the stories of people coming in through New York, right, when they came in big ships and everything, right? And the name spellings are wild. Well, the same here, especially the English names. The French have no clue how to spell any of it, so they're doing their best phonetically. So you can imagine, it's I think, the pressure of time, that they can't get all that information down. Other questions? George.
How did the refugees get to Geneva through the territory either of France that was against the Protestants or the Duke of Savoy? And then a second question, if I might.
Yep.
How was Geneva able to import grain and other foodstuffs and to export their products in order to pay for them?
So the second question is possibly the easier one. Geneva itself did not have much of a hinterland, so they can't grow a lot of crops. They do have a lot of grapes. They do a lot of wine, okay? But grain they're going to bring in probably from their Swiss allies. Most of the grain would be coming in from the Swiss allies, and the Swiss themselves could be getting it from further afield. So instead of looking westward toward France for that, the Genevans are often looking eastward and slightly north to the Swiss allies and getting supplies in that way, if they can. The bad times are when there's blockades, and Savoy sometimes blockades them, and then it's really, really bad. But most of the grain, they can get in, they can get enough food supply, and then they can sell their products as well. I mean, it's an interesting thing with products. Unless it's something that other authorities consider problematic, like books, okay? Cloth, grain, gold things, right? You can sell them to anyone. Like a Catholic will still buy Protestant goods if they are of sufficient quality, right? Your cloth is your cloth. And the interconfessional trade still continues. So there's much less of a problem that way. The problem is if you're trying to export anything that is considered very much heretical, and that would largely be books primarily. And then people. And now it comes to your second question, how do they get to Geneva? It depends on the time frame. Some of the times in France where persecution was breaking out, sometimes there was a sort of a truce beforehand, right? Before the warfare would kind of ramp up again. And in that period of truce, people can move if they want to. The area closest to Geneva is called the Dauphiné, and there were a lot of Reformed Protestants in the Dauphiné. So then people can kind of be smuggled. And when it's at its worst, they're essentially human smugglers, moving people in and out. And you pay people to bring you safely. In disguise, in however you can get there. The opening picture, I think, on my PowerPoint, let me see if I'll get it up again. I probably have turned it off, and that's my fault. Anyhow, if you look at the poster for my talk, you see these people arriving on foot, on horseback, in carts, however you can get there. It depends on the time period. Right? At its very worst, and probably the worst was after 1572, after the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre. Then people, scrambled to essentially adopt false names, false identities, false papers, anything they could to get over the border and over into Geneva. But in most cases, you could do the trip. You just try not to attract too much attention to yourself. And sometimes a bribe will get you past any guards that might be preventing you from getting there. Other questions?
Could you put up that slide with those two verses?
Let me do
again?
that right now. Just hang on 1 second. It's going to take a minute.
And the reason I asked that is we were going to take a picture of your screen because our son Jeremy, class of 99, Calvin grad, is the director of Refugees International, a non-governmental organization in Washington, D.C. So my question related to that then is, what wisdom is there from Calvin's preaching that would apply to our current situation? Refugees worldwide, actually, but particularly in our own country.
So the sermon that I've got here on Galatians 6, 9 to 11 is probably a really good resource. The whole sermon is it's not sort of specifically about refugees, but about the calling of Christians to care for others. And later on in the sermon, he says something like, even if the person is a Moor, which is their early version of someone who's Muslim, right? Even if they're a Moor or a barbarian, we are called by God to care for them because they are a brother just like we are, right? So I would go to that sermon in Galatians as my first port of call. I think that would be a very good resource, and it's a beautiful sermon. Yeah. Other questions? Doug Hyun. Well, we'll go to Doug Hyun first, then we'll come back to Wes. Go ahead.
Was there any factional conflicts between different international refugee groups?
Right, so different refugee groups having problems with each other. Is that what you're asking? Yeah. Most of the time, no, and partly is, again, that these communities were somewhat inward-looking. In other words, the Italians associate with the Italians, and the English associate with the English, and the French associate with the French. It was, in fact, another critique of the Genevans against the refugees, that these refugees were so inward-looking, and they would marry each other and not marry a young Genevan. Or they would make a business deal with someone else from their community, but not from someone else. So there's not that much tension between the communities because they are kind of linguistically and culturally working within their group and not so much outward until a few generations pass. And then perhaps there's more, if they remain in Geneva, then there's more flexibility across cultural and linguistic barriers. But the linguistic barriers are fairly significant, enough to keep people from really quarreling with each other, I would say.
Yeah, because given the circumstance, it is weird. It is weird that some international group endure their group's discrimination. That when some other some Genevan discriminate other people.
Yep.
So, but their group to which we belong, just endure and doesn't do anything. It is weird.
Yeah, I mean, it's a tricky situation, because the Genevans would say that these French refugees don't just endure it. In fact, and you can see how this happened, as the Genevans sold off more and more rights to become burgess to these immigrants, the voting blocks in Geneva actually changed, right? Because a burgess is someone who could vote, right? And now, if you admit more and more people to the right to vote, you're kind of changing the dynamic politically in the city, from majority native Genevan voters to more and more refugee voters, right? And in 1555, there's a big riot in Geneva from the native Genevans who are aware that they are losing political power, because the next elections, there will be more voters who are refugees than are native Genevans. And those voters will put everybody who likes Calvin in the magistrates, and all the opponents to Calvin will be out in the cold. And they have a near riot in Geneva over this. So there is a sense among the Genevans that it's not, oh, these poor refugees, everybody's mean to them. They see the refugees as quite calculating, as taking every advantage that is going their way. So it depends who you ask as to whether it's all on one side or it's on both ends. I think Wes had a question.
Well, I was going to ask the question that was
Yep.
asked, whether or not they gathered their districts or neighborhoods of same language.
So they do tend to
Yeah.
live close by each other. That makes total
Also,
sense.
are there, with the Genevans, are there prejudices against these people? As Italians are carry diseases and the kinds of thing in England you find attitude towards Southern Europeans.
Interesting. I haven't found anything that is particularly...
It would be hard. We'd be subtle anyway. Probably
Well,
not be.
I mean, the problem is the language that they use, right? A number of these upset Genevans describe the refugees as a scourge. The French word is actually un chancre, which is actually a cancer, right? So it's a medical term, right? But I don't know that they're implying anything of that they're dirty or not hygienic or something like that. I don't think that's where they're coming from. I think it's much more along the lines of they are infecting the body by their presence. But it's more of a metaphor rather than an actual, like these people aren't clean or something like that. I haven't seen particular complaints about other aspects of cultural practices or anything. I haven't seen those come up so much. Yes, Larry.
What was the time frame of this whole
So
phenomenon?
the pattern of people coming for refuge in Geneva began in the late 1530s, early 1540s. So Calvin, right, 1536, right? And he has fled. He has fled France, and he has found refuge in Geneva, among other places that he tried. So late 1530s, 1540s is kind of slow ramping, right? That was the one where I had 28 people in the space of a month, right? And then 1550s into the 1560s, that's a huge peak. That's just an enormous peak. That's the, 200 families in 2 days, right? It drops down again after the 1560s. It rises again in the 1570s with the massacre, St. Bartholomew's Day massacre, right? So it's a ebb and flow, right? But Geneva continues to be a place of refuge right through the 17th century, right? The revocation of the Edict of Nantes is 1685. That's another wave of people leaving France, right? But it comes and goes, right? And it depends on the situations on the home front, whether people have to flee or what situation they are. But I would say the mid-16th century is the high point of arrivals of religious refugees. And that's why I picked that decade.
You talked about a century.
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah, yeah. It's a constant. It's a constant. I mean, because it is difficult to live in some of these places, even into the 17th century, because of the strong push against Protestants in other places in Europe. But then there are other options, right? People could go to the Netherlands. People go to Strasbourg. Some people go to England at various points when it's safer in England than it is in France, right? So there are other options too. It's not like Geneva is the only choice. Right. Philip.
There's a comment about the significance and the contribution. It is interesting that at the international level, the definition of a refugee only pertains to persecution, political or religious.
Yes.
Secondly, in the light of this, it's very important to emphasize that religious freedom is also an inalienable right.
Yes.
So
Yep.
the contributions is very, very significant.
Yep, absolutely. And one more question here in the front.
Thank you. My question was there any like a connection or bridge building between the Genevans and the Frenchmen, the refugees, or was it always tension? Was there any hope that you found in your research?
So I think that's a good question. The challenge, of course, is that when there are problems, that's what survives in the records. When everyone's happy, you don't hear about it, right? So that's kind of the challenge. But there are evidences of connection. So one way to look at it is to see who stands as godfather and godmother for children in Geneva. So baptized, reformed babies in Geneva have godparents. It's not weird and Catholic. They continue doing godparenting. And godparenting is a way of making kinship networks, right? You pick a godparent because they will help bring up your child in case you die, right? And then there's also the spiritual aspect of it, but it's also a way to build kinship networks. So one way to study, is there a positive here, is to look at who gets to be godparents, right? Is it Genevans with Genevans and French with French? Or do Genevan parents say, hey, I'm going to ask so-and-so, this French person, to be a godparent to my baby? And one of the ways of just measuring that very basically is to see how many children John Calvin was godparent for. Tons of them, tons of them. So there is a sense in which, yeah, you do. If I would be looking for like what works well, I would look at baptism records, and I would also start looking at marriage records, right? Do they marry endogamally throughout their own community, or do they marry outside their community? In other words, how long does it take for someone who is a refugee to find a partner who is from the local community? And that would be a sign of people finding a new way to relate to each other. Yeah. Thank you. Oop, one more question. Bob, we'll make this the last one. Go ahead.
When was Calvin exiled from Geneva and why?
So he was exiled between 1538 and 1541, so 2.5 years after he got there. That is sort of a different story. It's partly a political story. Geneva accepted the Reformation in 1536, right? Who wants the Reformation? Lift your hand. All the hands go up. Yes, we want the Reformation, right? But the people who voted for the Reformation largely for political reasons, because it freed them completely from the overlordship of the Duke of Savoy, right? Their Catholic overlord. When they become Protestant, they are de facto declaring nothing to do with Savoy. We are our own thing. So the folks who voted for the Reformation did not necessarily understand what it meant. Calvin and Farel, the two lead pastors of Geneva, felt that in the 1536, 37, 38, they have to kind of teach people what it means to be Reformed. And among other things, they write out a quite sort of thorough confession of faith. And they bring it door to door to people, and you have to sign this now. And the Genevans are not happy about that. They feel like they're exchanging one tyranny for another, and they don't want that. Second problem, Geneva had made alliances with the Swiss Protestant cantons, Bern, Basel, Zurich. And in doing so, those cantons felt themselves to be the big brothers in the faith, right? They were Reformed earlier. We're going to show you how to be Reformed. Do it like we do it. But Calvin and Farel saw things a little differently. And especially they fight over, is it the power of the church? Does the church have any autonomy to organize church discipline? Or is it something the government does? In Bern, Basel, Zurich, it's totally done by the government. right? Now in Geneva, the pastors say, no, we are the ones who should watch for access to the Lord's table. So they fight about that. So there's a lot of different problems. And in 1538, the Genevan magistrates, who are kind of being pulled in two directions, right, by the Swiss canton saying it, do this, the pastors saying, no, do it that way. The magistrates essentially get fed up. And they decide, no, this is not possible. Farel and Calvin don't listen to their magistrates, and they're essentially told, if you preach on this Sunday, you're going to have to go. And the two men and one other one stood up and said, we're going to preach anyhow, and they do, and they're therefore kicked out of the city. But 3 years later, he's called back, so what can we do? You know, the Genevans decided they needed him after all. So, all right, ladies and gentlemen, we will stop here. Thank you very much.